and how much time it will expire, the poor user can't even manually keep them in sync, right? So the simplest option for this is, any guesses? What's the best option for them? Excel. So that's probably the simplest option. Or you run a formula. So you take your daughter's date of birth, or you take something else, and every time it expires, you just add one number to it and see if it will work. I think all of us have been guilty of doing something like that at some point or the other. I remember one speaker giving me an example like that, and I thought, oh, maybe he's already guessed my password. So, yeah. Ghost accounts. I'm sure this is a concern, but this is a concern that comes up in two ways. One, a lot of people are certain that their systems have ghost accounts, which are accounts which are not accounted for, orphans. But there's a bigger problem. We don't know which accounts are those ghost accounts. Now, this may seem circular logic, because if you knew that they are ghost accounts, you would have probably gotten rid of them. The fact that they've probably grown to so many over the years, you now have no idea. Or you have accounts who were once valid, but now no longer valid, because you've not gone through a re-attestation cycle, or the linking between, say, an employee's access and the accounts that he gets in a variety of places has not been there. This is also exceptionally true for access of contractors and vendors, right? Which is, because for employees, there's still a lot more, say, adherence to process in terms of onboarding and offboarding and all of that. But when it comes to vendors and tracking places where they may have access, at least my experience largely has been that there are very few organizations who upfront track who are all the vendors in my IT ecosystem and where do they have what access. Okay, so it kind of degenerates very fast. In fact, once I implement a solution, it's a very gratifying day to see the solution delete my user account on my last day on that project. So, but that doesn't happen as a norm otherwise. Okay, efficiency. Yeah. So. These are the days of churn, right? If your attrition is below 18%, you should probably pat yourself on the back, right? So there's a lot of churn that's happening, and you couple that with growth, it means there are a lot of new people regularly onboarding organizations, and they need basic access or new access to be able to do the job and do the job well. And frankly, if you're paying them while you're not giving them access, you might as well give them that money for free, right? So there's a huge cost right there, and gets multiplied when you look at the overall industry and the volumes with which people become new employees and don't get access for, say, 10 days. But it's more interesting in terms of getting the access, because if employees don't have access, all of us scream and shout and make sure that we get the access to be able to do a good job, on those first few days. But when was the last time that a user came to you and said, I do not need this access anymore, please revoke it? I don't think that's ever happened. And very frankly, even I as an end user, the only time I do it is when I'm working with a customer and I say, I've done what I had to do with the root access, please remove it so that if something goes wrong, you can't tell me that I have root access. Otherwise, even somebody like me who's in the space never volunteers to say that I do not need this access anymore, right? So there are two aspects of around that. And then not knowing who has access to what. Sounds like a very basic question, but it's not straightforward to answer, especially if you have a multitude of applications that you're dealing with, and there's a lot of churn and you don't have a central place to track it in. And help desks, yes. So help desks seem to be doing a lot of repetitive, predictive kind of work, and if you think about it, very large-scale internet organizations have solved that problem without help desks, but we still engage them. For example, if you look at password reset, right? Now, when was the last time somebody in this room called Google help desk or Yahoo help desk? I don't think you've ever done that, right? I mean, you may have forgotten the password. I understand they don't force you to expire your password, I understand that. So you may not have changed it for the last 8 years, which is a completely different discussion. But fact of the matter is that they largely get by without having a human help desk in place. And that is not the case in organizations. In organizations, you talk about Aujas, we have 250 people, we've got a help desk. Surprising, we don't even have a plethora of applications, but we have a help desk, and we need it. So they're earning the keep, right? So obviously, there's a very strong case for making sure that the usual kind of work can be automated, and in fact, the end user can be empowered with it. So that the SLA and everything else is controlled by the end user. You want to reset your password, you reset it as fast as you can type. Simple. It is as good as that. Okay. We'll talk about some other points now. So, archive all approvals. So whether it's paper, whether it's email, it's tedious, it's complex, it's non-reportable. If reporting is manual, aggregation of data itself is the first problem. The second problem is it's extremely predictable. So if you've got recertification cycles, if you've got regular audits, it's largely useless because if you want to do a sincere job of the audit, most of the IT team or the security team, which is us in a lot of cases, know exactly when that's going to happen. Which means we may pass the process on paper, but very frankly, if I am a disgruntled administrator of an AS400 mainframe, and I know every 3 months you're going to do a recertification cycle, you're not going to catch the accounts that I created for myself. And I'm sure everybody in this room has that confidence, that if I'm sitting on that side, and I know it's a predictable audit, I know exactly how to defeat it. We agree? Largely, right? Okay. So, so the problem is that it's predictable, and for whatever is happening, there are not many audit trails. There are not many audit trails for what admins did. There are not many audit trails for what users did. We're often dependent on what the application itself can provide us. And with admins, it gets worse. So that's very interesting. So when was the last time when you realized that I'm forcing my users, my normal, I would not say underprivileged, but non-privileged users, I'm forcing them to change the password every 45 days. And I have not forced my admins to change their passwords for the operating systems and the databases and the application servers in the last 2 years now. Anybody agree with that kind of a thought here? That happens, right? Which is interesting because that's the most critical access. And admins may move out of the system all the time. I mean, they're like yet another employee, right? So he moves to another organization, and now he in his mind has access to a lot of systems and usernames and passwords which are never being changed. So it's interesting on whom we manage to be strict on, and where our greatest exposure is where we really not do much, right? So that was the admins. It's not the CXOs only, it's not the CISOs or the CIOs only who are unhappy with this state of affairs. Business obviously has a regular set of problems. First is probably it's taking too much time, it's complex, you're coming in the way of me doing business. I'm sure all of us in security have heard that before, right? Okay. IT administrators, they have their own share of challenges in terms of there's a lot of data in silos, there's a lot of load coming in for help desk in terms of automate this, write a script for that, so on and so forth. And then there's a less appreciated aspect on application development and managers. We just assume that it has to be different every time. But if you think about it, if you have a consolidated layer for identity and access management, then your application development lifecycle does not need to reinvent the wheel every time. You just consume services from a common entity, which makes sure that you get common, you get common identity, common access, centralized roles, and the application developer focuses on developing the business logic, not the authentication, authorization, and everything else around it. Because in that case, then every application, becomes its own fort, actually, right? So we'll talk about typical provisioning scenarios. You got a bunch of actors, including, former employees. You've got tons of enterprise resources that folks need access to, and they've got multiple touch points, right? So because it's not centralized, figuring out who has access to what is pretty nightmarish. It's pretty nightmarish. And earlier approaches have said, let's try to consolidate on a user naming schema and all of that. But I'm sure all of us have run into that one system that doesn't allow a username of more than 8 characters, right? And everything else was accepting 10 characters, and suddenly you have a problem, okay? So, or there's a system that doesn't accept a username starting with with a number. That's pretty nightmarish for companies who say that, let's use the employee number at least as a unique identifier. So it is nightmarish in this scenario. And essentially what happens is if you look at the life cycle, and you just see how much time gets wasted all over. So there's a new user who comes on board, first day at office, really kicked about the new job, okay? Fills up his, create my bank account form and everything else, and then says, okay, now give me access and I want to work. And starts creating all kinds of access requests, either in, say, a ticketing system or on paper forms, depending on what kind of organization you're dealing with. I've also found in a lot of places paper forms have been replaced by Word forms. So it's the same thing. It's just that it's not paper. It's just a Word document that gets filled up and then goes somewhere. Okay. So the inefficiencies related to it are still the same. Okay. And then what happens is that the rules are examined, and then somebody needs to approve it. So you need to figure out who can approve it, and if this guy is not there, who else can approve it? Well, let's keep in mind that because humans can take these decisions very well, in terms of this person is not there, but this guy needs access, so who else can approve it? A human can take this decision pretty well, right? It is discretionary decision making, but he can do it pretty well. He can figure out who is a peer and all of that. Organizations continue to function, but there are two problems there. One, you now have discretionary decisions coming in, or things get stalled. Two, because business goes on, there is no need to define or refine the process, and then it becomes, it is held hostage to the situation where the process is not mature enough, so it can't be automated, so you can't embrace IAM. Because if you're implementing an IAM system, it will demand that maturity in the processes, where on paper you've determined this guy is not there, then what? Make sense? So it kind of, it kind of gets the job done, and then it holds you down rather than letting you take off. Okay, so approval routing happens, gets to IT, gets to the administrators, and they do their job. But it's not that simple, because you would have backlogs, you will have delays, you will have errors, forms are not completed correctly, forms are not interpreted correctly, the number of users and the requests are growing, the number of applications are growing, and then obviously finally the administrator went and did something, but where's the actual proof linking it all up, right? So we say identity and access management is a diverse solution domain, which means there are various parts to this elephant. Depending on whom you ask, he'll probably define a different aspect of it. And what is very important is that upfront the requirements are distilled, which is why at least the discussions that that we and IBM have with customers are not really around identity and access. I mean, that's just a term that we are using to say define these class of problems. But it's very important to to prioritize and distill which are the exact problems that you want to start solving first. Okay, I know there are a few cloud enthusiasts also in the crowd, and identity both from a problem statement as well as from a solution standpoint is radically getting redefined in that space. If I don't cover it during the course of this discussion, I'd love to have a conversation subsequent. But it definitely a lot of things are moving to the cloud as well, and there, if you think about it, if you really think about identity, so first there were very large data centers and IT is all monolithic, right? And then the first thing that happened was some of the services moved out, but the data centers still contained the infrastructure, but the services moved out. Somebody else picked up certain services, and then what happened was the assets still remained yours, but they moved outside of your data center. So they moved to, say, a hosted center or something like that. And then at a different layer, you say, actually, I'm not even interested in that. You just abstract it completely and move it to, say, a platform layer or to a SaaS layer. And I'm not really peeking, beyond it. Somebody else runs it. Somebody else maintains the uptime. I just consume it. And if you look at IT's role in this entire evolution, what is the one thing that IT is still controlling then? Because it definitely lost the perimeter in the context of movement to cloud. Then what's the one thing that IT is really controlling? Access. That's probably the only thing that IT is now determining. Hence, this is of utmost criticality to the organization. Okay. So, so what we'll do now is, as I just mentioned, this very diverse thing. I had no clue it will get projected right like this, otherwise I would have used different colors. But I'll quickly go over some of these points. So the different set of problems or areas that need to be addressed, and they can all be taken up individually or they can be sewn together. So the standard advice is, let's not try to boil the ocean. Let's try to figure out what is the core problem that we want to solve, and always start with that. Scope creep is a huge, huge terror in IAM programs, and that's one of the reasons why they fail. So, got password, credential, and profile management, extremely basic stuff. Let the end user manage his own password, simple, right? In fact, I've had organizations who implemented this and had tremendous success. We've got a slide on how the tickets fell over a period of time. But there was still this bunch of users who refused to reset the password themselves and would repeatedly call the help desk. and IT got authorization for business to start charging that business unit for every password reset. That was very exciting. So obviously, we empower the end user into managing his own credentials. Start controlling automatically at least basic access. Whatever you can determine on the basis of role, department, function, all of that, so granted automatically, right? It makes a lot more sense to manage it like that than to have everybody request it, have everybody approve it. Because if you think about it, and there'll be a box on access review there, access that are automatically granted need not really be periodically reviewed, because when the business situation changes, it will automatically be revoked as well. But everything that is explicitly approved must be reviewed, because you do not know whether, say, 3 months or 6 months later, the use case or the business case still stays that that person needs that access. So it's in the interest of the organization to try to automate as much of the minimal access as possible, so that not only is operations smoothened out, but also your recertification cycles are now easier, because you don't need to retest that. Think about it. If everybody needs manual approval on creation of AD account, it means every AD account now needs to be recertified. But if you establish that everybody or 99% people in my company get AD, then it means, okay, let's give it to all the 100% and be done with this, right? Okay. So that's there. Automated role and access. So I think we spoke about that. Let the system figure out who is the approver, what to do. Let the end user not worry about knowing who can approve and all of that, and let the end user approve. So this is like democracy for the end user. It's of the user, for the user, by the user, right? So IT becomes the facilitator. We facilitate while we enhance security rather than compromising it, which is a welcome change, because normally most things that are convenient make things insecure. So instead of that, we actually enhance the security, and we now have a system where it's the business user who requests things, it's the business owner who approves things, and the system grants or removes access automatically. No longer is it just IT's problem. Make sense? And that's a huge shift in terms of accountability as well in organizations, where now business owners need to start deciding very clearly, do I have to grant this person access so that he can do his job or not? Rather than say, I don't know, I'm okay with this. I'll let the IT folks figure this one out. Okay, so that shift is definitely there. Deprovisioning, yep. So it's not. So I think the killer term there is kill switch, and you'll be surprised with what amount of frequency I've come across these things in working with large organizations. You set up a system. 2 months into the system, you get a call which says, this vice president and these 3 reportees, please disable all their access immediately. Now, we don't talk about this, but I'm sure these kind of things have come to you as well, right? And there are a variety of reasons why that happens, but if you don't know where all he has access, you have no way of killing his access. Worse, if there are folks who've spent, say, a significant amount of time in the company, let's keep in mind what we discussed earlier. Access is additive, which means if I don't have access, I'm going to scream and shout till I get that access. But once I have it, I'm never going to say that I'm done with this. So if I spent 5 years in an organization, last 2 years in HR, before that I was in finance or payroll, I pretty much know everything about everybody that I need to. Okay? So access is additive, let's keep that in mind. So and hence the kill switch is extremely important. Digitization of workflows, no-brainer, contractor management, reconciliation. I think this point often comes up. Anybody from the banking industry here? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of these terms seem very similar to language used in the banking domain. There's reconciliation, there's accounts, and I've had more confusion earlier also in having a discussion. But reconciliation is a very simple task. You look at a piece of paper and you say, these are the people who should have this kind of access. And you look at the system and you say, who are the people and what kind of access do they have, and is there a gap in this? So it's an extremely simple task, and it is nightmarish to carry out honestly. I say honestly because you can get the job done, but to do a good, thorough job honestly every 3 months is nightmarish. Okay? I've worked with organizations who've staffed full-time teams who work through 3-month cycles doing reconciliation for all their accounts, and at the end of 3 months they're back to doing the same cycle again, right? And it multiplies as your, say, server counts go up, as the application counts go up, and so on and so forth. But if you think about the task, it's actually not very complex. You've got one list, or you wish you had one list, and you've got one list on the system which says these are the accounts that are actually there. and you compare them and you try to answer the question, should this still be there? So it's classic work that computers should be used to. Periodic access review is something that we discussed. Enforcement of separation of duties. I think that's critical. That's critical in the sense that application is now complex, access is also complex, but business normally knows which combinations are toxic from a business standpoint. So for example, procurement will clearly know that the person who can sign up a vendor should not be able to release a PO to a vendor, should not be the same guy who can approve an invoice from the vendor. Let's say, I'm saying an extremely simplistic example. Where does this get segregated? Nowhere actually. And even if point products allow you to do it, they allow you to do it inside an application. What about across applications? If he has access to application A, don't give him access to application B. Things like that. And those are extremely relevant use cases. We are also seeing a lot of those use cases coming up in the shared services model. The customers are very clear, these team members are for me and they'll do only this and they'll not do anything for any other customer and so on and so forth, right? That said, I'll move slightly faster on this. So, role discovery and optimization is actually much hyped. Role management is much hyped. Let me share very honestly with you. If you can bring your access management to around 75% role-based and 25% discretionary, you've done a fantastic job. Okay? Because I don't think we're talking about the military here. It's only in the military where it's so clearly distilled that you know that if the guy got, if the guy took a bullet, you need to fit in a guy and he'll do these 5 things and you're done. It's not like that. I'm sure most of us here are wearing more than one hat. You agree? So we've got a day job, but we've got an afternoon job and an evening responsibility as well tied to it. So role discovery is tedious, complex, and should be attempted only after you've done all the hygiene work. Desktop SSO is essentially way of doing single sign-on for applications which are non-web based as well as web-based, all of that. Have policy-based authentication, which is essentially figuring out where is the user coming from, what is his risk level, so on and so forth. And there are tons of things for, say, reporting privileged access. Privileged access, I mentioned earlier, is a huge problem. And now, finally, you've got a class of solutions dedicated to solving that problem. Because the basic difference, and I'll just cover that very quickly, the basic difference in privileged access or administrative access and normal normal user access is that the lifecycle management is completely different. Normal user access, the guy comes in, you create an identity, you create accounts for him, you link these up, you go out of the company, you delete his identity, you delete his accounts, or you disable the accounts and then delete them later. Done, extremely clean. Sorry. For admins, that's not the case. For the admins, the guy comes in, you create an identity, but he already has accounts. He's got a root here, he's got an admin there, he's got an Oracle user there, he's got a DB user there, he's got a WebSphere user here, and he's going to need access to those things. So then you establish which admin needs access to which of these accounts, and how do you differentiate in 3 admins requiring access to the same root account? How do you prove accountability on who was the admin who used the root account to do a certain thing? And when they leave the organization, you just decouple this link. The account stays intact. So the lifecycle management is completely different. Yeah. So if you look at those problem areas, it makes sense to organize, say, a solution portfolio around access governance, digital identity management, and access management, and single sign-on. I'll very quickly talk about federation as well, and I'm sure that will interest you as well. So federation essentially, it's been around for more than 10 years now. It's come up in a major way to facilitate single sign-on across, say, different domains, but across different participating entities. So let's say you're an organization, you've got multiple partners, and you're sick of managing your accounts of your partners in your systems. All that you need to do is you need to enable federation on your applications, and then they can start consuming it, and they can pretty much access your applications without you needing to go through the hassle. Privilege ID management we mentioned, also ubiquitous and converged access, which are definitely picking up. There's still a long way to go in this in terms of standardization, but the requirements are definitely picking up. That I want logical access control to be coupled with physical access control. For example, for one of our customers, we implemented a solution where if you don't swipe in on the gate in the morning, your accounts don't get unlocked, and so on and so forth. So there's a linkage in what's happening at a physical layer versus what's happening at a logical access layer. Yeah, so if you put a consolidated system together, it is pretty much straightforward. So there is one place which can talk to a multitude of systems, manage your accounts, do reconciliation for you, and then run central workflow services, run reporting, business intelligence, and all of that. So if you talk about a lifecycle approach to how to get the job done, the idea is to do strategy and planning, and I'll not mince words here. If this is not done adequately, most implementations are failure. Most implementations in IIM are failure if this is not done adequately. So it's extremely important that this is done adequately. It's okay to start small, but it's very important to be very clear on what you're going to achieve. This is also important because this is the stage where you're going to get buy-in. Let's keep in mind, IIM implementations are not implementations in the corner of a room. You're going to involve HR because you're going to need their data, which means you're going to find problems in their processes, you're going to find problems in the data quality when you're going to try and integrate, right? So you're not going to get them very happy. You will need cooperation from the application owners because the applications are typically used to managing the user accounts themselves, but now they need to be either tweaked or modified or have APIs open so that an external entity can create accounts on them. So they may or may not be very happy or may not fall into in their priorities. Third, a lot of processes are now going to be revisited or changed, right? So it's not going to be very easy. So because it's a multitude of functions that get involved in the decision making, it's extremely important that the buy-in is established upfront, and that's the core objective of doing a good job at strategy and planning it. Okay. Then obviously there is solution implementation that depends on which tracks you decide to pick up, which problems you want to solve. Do you want to go after the lower hanging fruits first, or do you want to say that I know it's a complex problem, but I just have to solve it first? And then obviously you enter operations and sustenance. So couple of stats based on real world data. Quick search on Google says saying IIM implementation failure, then you'll know very clearly. Okay. And in planning, the recommendation normally is obviously there are a whole 9 yards to it, and you may decide to pick and choose depending on the scope that you're looking at. The idea is to be very clear on where you stand, which is a readiness assessment, very candid assessment on where do I stand right now. For example, if you know that you're not very strong from a processes standpoint, you should not expect miracles from an automation solution because it's going to demand a lot of maturity in terms of processes to be able to do something repeatedly, because the system will not have the discretionary power of a human that if this guy is not there, whom should I give access to? Take that to what's the ROI, and I'm sure some of you are very eager on that. We'll get to a slide on that very quickly. Do a high level of requirement analysis and set the roadmap in place, the strategy in place, a high level architecture in place, and move ahead on product selection. Okay. So again, my apologies. I wish this was readable, but essentially this is for insurance major here in Bangalore that we implemented access management, identity management, single sign-on. And if any one of you would like to visit them, I'll be happy to facilitate it. Essentially, it's a Fortune 500 insurance MNC. This is MetLife India Corporation, and they had approximately 13,000 users at that point of time. Projected to grow, plenty of reporting parameters required, some 30 applications because we, like I said, don't start too large. A lot of compliance requirements because they had some mandates from the US entity as well as Indian operations required various compliances. And what we did was we did an executive workshop for them, helped them plan, did an ROI case. And something very interesting happened in the ROI case, and I'll talk about that when I get there. So this is just a basic way of looking at an ROI case. It's one of the few things where in security, you can say that, yeah, I have an ROI case. Otherwise, in security, it's difficult to come up with a concept of ROSI, right? It's very difficult to say what's the value of having a security guard sitting at the main door. You really don't know until you take him off, right? So unlike that, the benefits here there are tangible benefits and obviously the soft benefits. And I'll take only one aspect. I'll for a while ignore a lot of other aspects in the cost case just to keep it extremely simple. But what we essentially do is get a lot of basic data in terms of how many employees do you have, how many password resets do you have in a year, how much time did it take you to reset a password, and what's the median or average salary of an employee. Very basic data, right? Just this much. And the calculation is pretty straightforward. So essentially what we do is you compute the number of minutes or hours or months in a year that get wasted